I'm very happy to be here sharing this panel. I'm Carola Frediani. I'm a journalist at Stampa, and I'm happy to be here with Claudio Guarnieri, who is a well-known security researcher and activist, who did a great work on analyzing and tracking down attacks to journalists and activists, attacks made mainly through spyware, but they are not limited to them. And the title of this panel is a little bit strong, so when journalists are targets. The fact is that there are many risks that journalists can face in a digital context. Many of these are related to the technical and political transformations of the digital world and the fact that this same digital world is becoming more relevant in our lives. Journalists are especially vulnerable to digital surveillance and cyber attacks for different reasons. The first one is, of course, that they are a valuable target of informations you can get to sources, whistleblower, activists, dissidents, criminals through journalists. And you don't even have to bother to ask them or to drag them to court, where they could defend themselves, maybe, and try to defend their sources and their connections. Because as you know, at least in many democracies, the protection of sources is formally recognized. So you can skip this and get the info from their communications, from their communication flows, from the metadata, through their devices. The second reason journalists are targets in the digital era is because of their profession, of course. They are more exposed to risk because they need to talk and communicate with everyone, and most of the time with everyone, and most of the time with people who they don't really know or they don't know much. So they need also to check things, open links, read emails, download leaks, trying to verify them. All this activity makes them very vulnerable to different kinds of digital attacks. The third reason cyber attacks against journalists will probably increase is that, attacking journalists in public is not nice. Most of the time, it can have backlashes. But cyber attacking them, sending offline their website, spying on their communications in order maybe, to get to sources or to blackmail them or just to smear them, is more stealth. So I think we should try with Claudio, we will try to look at some stories, because going into the detail of some real-life stories can help to understand more what we are talking about. Could be a little bit theoretical. So I would like to start from a specific story which happened in Morocco in 2012. There was this journalist, Isham Al-Mirat. At the time, he was part of this network of citizen reporters who covered the Arab Spring. It was called Manfaking. And the site published investigations and also collaborated with anonymous sources that could provide sensitive material. I think the site was also awarded an award, like Global Voice Award, for their work on free speech. But Al-Mirat, this journalist, and his group was targeted by a spyware, and that I interviewed him in 2013, and he told me that also because of that attack, it was a blow to the site, and it it helped like the disgregation of the group that was working at the time together because of the stress and the worries related to the attack. So since Claudio worked on this case, together in this group, which is called Citizen Lab, which is a group of researchers about security and that tracked down a lot of this kind of spyware in the last years. I will let now Claudio to talk about this case, and then we will go through some other cases. Right.
Sorry, I was distracted.
Yeah, you can.
No, so yeah, we're gonna go through a few examples, and while they might look very similar one to another, because in the end, as Carola mentioned, I mostly deal and mostly work with certain type of attacks. I don't deal necessarily with all sorts of types of digital security issues. I don't really deal with mass surveillance. I don't really deal with wiretapping. I mostly deal with people that are being directly targeted, that are being selected because of the work that they do, and therefore then they're specifically targeted with some reasonably sophisticated types of attacks, which in most cases boils down to try to compromise their computers and turn their computers into spying devices to collect all sorts of information that they might have at that time. Morocco was one of the first examples of these types of things that we worked on. A lot of this work was done in the context of a Citizen Lab research, which is a laboratory that kind of research on digital threats to civil society and their intersection with human rights issues. What happened in Morocco was a good example because of some of the things that Carola already mentioned. So to sum up again, Morocco was between 2011 and 2012 was in a time of political distress. This is kind of at a time where the Arab Spring was fading out a little bit. Morocco wasn't exactly at the center of the Arab Spring, but it still experienced a lot of protests, and people kind of felt galvanized in similar ways to try to achieve a certain level of democracy when all the other countries surrounding them were doing the same. And Manfakinch, which, as said, was kind of a citizen journalistic project that was run at that time, was very active in reporting on what was happening in the streets and reporting on what the people were trying to achieve and certain protests that were happening during that time. And because of that, they gained a lot of attention. They gained a lot of attention internationally. As Carola said, they also received some awards from Google and from Global Voices and so on for their work. But they also received a lot of interest, obviously, locally, because they were bringing out to the public, not just in Morocco, but at an international level, what was happening inside the country. And because of that, they got targeted. And we'll go through some of these examples later, but all of them show different reasons why people get targeted, besides the ways that they get targeted. But very often, there are different motivations why certain groups and certain people are specifically targeted. Manfakinch obviously was probably during the work of the reporting in contact with people on the ground and people active in the political protests that were happening at that time. And perhaps probably the interest behind attacking this particular group was trying to reconstruct what was the network of people they were in contact with, where were they getting the sources and the information they were publishing, and so on and so forth. It was also a significant case because it was the first documented case of hacking team software being used in the wild. That's actually how hacking team software got discovered in the first place. They originally noticed they got targeted, that some software was being sent to them. In the specific case, the attackers, which we suppose it must have been some state agency of the Moroccan government, but still, they sent some message through the contact form at the website. The website exposed, the usual contact us page. They had a form where you could leave a message and leave an email address, generally used for receiving tips for articles to be published. And they used this trusted messaging system for them to receive tips. The attackers used it to deliver the attack. They sent a message. They pretended to be a source. They pretended to have some exclusive information about what was happening in Morocco, and they pointed to a specific URL to download this information. This URL obviously was not containing any relevant information, but it was rather a malicious website that would exploit certain vulnerabilities to download on the computer or the victim computer software, which would then get installed and would activate certain functions that would, allow the attacker to spy on the victim in different ways, both using the webcam, using the microphone, and turning them on to, kind of get a surrounding interception of the environment, as well as intercepting Skype chats, intercepting messaging, intercepting emails, intercepting the traffic that they were generating. But only later, after this peculiar case, specific case, was discovered that the software in that case, the malware, the spyware that was delivered to them through this method was actually hacking team software. And in that sense was both useful as a starting point to develop a larger research effort that Citizen Lab undertook for many years on trying to identify more victims and more deployments of hacking team infrastructure, which is something that we can perhaps discuss later. But it was also significant because it was one of the first very well documented human rights abuses through digital means in a context of a very specific political context, in context where a European company was participant, or at least indirectly participant to this. There's many lessons learned from this case. The first one, how they perpetrated the attack. When journalists kind of establish certain, all journalists have some ways to get in contact. That's how journalists, receive information. They need to get sources. They need to get, especially in times like those, they need to get a starting point for people to contact them, and they need to have a place where people can approach them in a secure way or in a trusted way, and get in contact with them and talk with them. So the mistake they made, obviously, was to trust this vehicle when the vehicle was abused by the attacker. And that was a great lesson. The outcome of this situation was, as Carola mentioned, it had a huge chilling effect. When they went public, because they did decide to go public about this incident, the website, the group of journalists kind of suffered a great deal. Not just personally, some of them are currently actually under investigation for treason or similar accusations, but also was one of the primary causes for Mamfakinch, the group itself, to shut down. Because at a point when it's public knowledge that the journalistic group has been targeted and it's under scrutiny by the authorities, all the sources get fearful, and they're afraid of getting involved into certain types of reprisals. And that contributed to the death, pretty much, of the organization. When the sources don't trust the journalists anymore, or at least they don't feel safe in contacting and communicating with the journalists anymore, they don't go to them. And at that point, obviously, Mamfakinch was one of the prominent ones. And when you cut off sources from one of the prominent news outlets in a time of, again, political distress, you cut out a lot of news making in a point where it was important to get information out. Some of them continued in different media. Some of them stopped altogether doing this type of work. And currently, it's still somewhat of an open case. As I mentioned, some of them are under investigation for destabilizing the security of the state and accusations of this kind. So this was one good example.
But you and as a Citizen Lab later on investigated also other cases in other countries. One of them was Ethiopia, and you published a report documenting how some journalists working for the Ethiopian satellite television service who were actually abroad, not in their country, right? Were based in the US or anyway not in Ethiopia, but they were targeted by spyware. And so also it was an interesting case as well, targeting the journalists also in the diaspora. And was it similar also in the pattern? What kind of differences?
Was another very interesting case, and I'll get to most of the reasons in a minute. But the first reason why it was an interesting case is because it's kind of the most common type of situation where you find journalists to be targeted in these ways. Most of the people that we see, most of the journalists that we see targeted, especially through the use of spyware and through the use of exploitation and more sophisticated techniques, actually do not live inside the country. When the journalists live inside the country, they can get surveilled and monitored in different ways, both physically with people following them and so on, but also through passive surveillance and wiretapping and more traditional methods, because they're located within the jurisdiction where the authorities have certain types of access. When they're not within the country where they're writing about or where they're more controversial, and very often, most often, the authorities or the intelligence services or whoever is interested in going after them need to recur to these types of techniques. So again, compromising the computers and infecting them and attacking them in a more offensive and intrusive way. ESET was an example of them. We actually identified different Ethiopian groups that were targeted similarly. ESET in this specific case is a satellite television as well as a website where they publish news and information about what is happening inside Ethiopia. They're not very well seen within the Ethiopian state apparatus because of the reporting work that they do. And being very active and being very critical of the government, they got a certain level of attention, and they got similarly targeted. Again, in this case, also with Hacking Team software. The way that they got targeted in this case was a bit more peculiar. So, and this is another interesting lesson to be learned. In this case, what happened was this organization, to receive tips and to get in contact with their sources, used Skype mostly, actually. So they had Skype contact available on their website, I believe, and people could get in contact with them and talk with them and eventually provide information for them to publish. And this, again, was a trusted vehicle. So they established trusted relationships with some of the people over the time, and some of these sources obviously gained a certain level of familiarity and intimacy with ESET itself. What happens sometimes, and not just in the case of ESET, but we've seen it in similar cases in other countries, is that when someone within the country, for example, a source, is identified and arrested, this happens very often, for instance, in Iran. They get all their electronic equipment seized. They get their accounts, seized as well, being a Skype account, Facebook account, and Gmail accounts. And the attackers use these accounts to pretend to be the same source, contact the journalist, and use the established trust relationship and established trusted communication vehicle to attack the journalists themselves. In this case, that's what happened. They had a Skype contact already in their list, which disappeared for a certain amount of time, and then suddenly came back and contacted them, telling them that they had additional information that they wanted to publish, and that they wrote an article. And so they started chatting. As you see in the screenshot, this is the logs of the Skype chat. This was quite an interesting case for us because we noticed that attack happened the moment it was actually happening. So we managed to actually stop it quite early on, and kind of instruct the journalists to how to react to it and how to deal with that specific situation, and eventually also try to collect more details on who was going after them. And so at the other end, the journalists working for the organization started engaging with the person that was trying to attack him, which was a very good case for us to study. So in this case, as you see in the screenshot, someone contacted them, pretended to have an article to be published on the website, and it says, please accept this article, looking forward to hear your comments. So someone was lively interacting with them on Skype. Inside the archive, there was something that looked like a PDF document. Instead, it was not a PDF document. It was a Windows executable just with a PDF icon, just to trick the victim to open the document. And then they reply back and they say, this is not an article, it's an application, I will not open it. And then the attacker suddenly is a bit caught off guard and start to try to save himself in this situation and try to convince them, no, it's really a PDF article. And they reply, no, it's an executable, it's not a PDF. And why do you send it as a zip file? And so he goes back, the attacker goes back, and they say, yeah, I read it, it worked for me, but I will check again. After a little bit, they get back to them, and this time they resend. They try to send again another article, or rather the same alleged article, but in a different format. instead, this time, instead of just trying to trick the victim to open directly an executable which would infect the computer, they crafted a document, an Office document with an exploit in it. So they prepared an exploit that would leverage a vulnerability in Microsoft Office, and if the exploit would work, it would then download and deploy the executable they tried to send them later. And so they tried to send that over, trying to trick them into opening it, but it didn't really work out very well. At this point, the journalists, likely enough, we were already communicating with them and we were instructing them that this was an attempted type of attack. And in the end, the attack didn't work. But it was an interesting case for us still to see how these types of tactics are being employed in different situations. And we collected, obviously, data, which is always very useful from a research point of view to identify deployments and copies of the malware and analyze them further to see what actually happened. So you can see different type of techniques, different type of methods that are being employed according to, firstly, what the journalist is being set up with in order to communicate with the sources, as well trying to abuse of the methods and abuse of the relationships that are established already with trusted sources. And this happens a lot, happens more often than you would think. Especially again in diaspora situations where people within a country want to get information out because it would be suppressed by the media inside the country. Being able to leverage that, again, trusted relationship between the source and the journalist is often one of the most successful tactics to be able to trick the journalist to do a mistake.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting also the conversation they had, a little bit clumsy, like, no, it's not an X. But there was another case, which is more complicated, about South America, that Citizen Lab investigated, and was, again, like a spyware tracked down in different nations, right, and targeting political opposition and independent press. And it was called Operation Packrat, right, at the end?
Yeah, that's the name that we gave to it.
That's the name we gave to this operation, maybe managed by some state entity. There was also one detail that seems interesting to me, that in this case, even the researchers who were doing the investigation have been kind of targeted in the sense that they've been threatened, right? They've been threatened lively, directly by the hackers, right?
Yeah,
Can you also tell us a little bit
unfortunately,
about
I don't have material of this here, but you can find it online. So this is another research that we undertook during the course of the last year. It started off actually in a completely different context, where a prominent Argentinian lawyer at the beginning of 2015 was found dead in his home. And news articles came out. It was a big scandal in the country. And some details came out of his mobile phone getting compromised. And they just published, for example, some file names of things that they found in their computer and so on. And starting from these details, we started researching further, and we found a huge spying operation that lasted for several years, probably more than 5 years, spanning all over Latin America. So it started off in Argentina, and then we saw evidence back of similar attacks happening in Brazil and Ecuador and all sorts of countries in Latin America, interestingly targeting pretty much all sorts of parts of society. Many journalists, especially in some countries, many opposition groups in other countries, as well even government officials in other countries again. For us, it's still a bit unclear who is behind. The problem with these types of attacks, by the nature of these attacks, give a lot of plausible deniability to the attacker. It's very difficult to identify who's behind the attacks. Almost always, you're not going to come up with evidence that will definitely, indicate that a specific government or a specific state agency is behind the attack, just because it's just technically very difficult to collect this kind of evidence. And so it makes it also difficult to assess sometimes what is the motivation behind it. And in this case of Latin America, it's still very confused for us. It was interesting, as you mentioned, because these specific attackers were very active for a long period of time, not excessively sophisticated. Actually, in most cases, these types of attacks, from a technical standpoint, they're not sophisticated at all, but they still manage to be quite successful, mostly because of like social engineering tactics that they employ. They were very active for a long period of time, and then we started monitoring them and researching further, and at some point they noticed that someone was kind of going after them. We were researching them at that point for 2 or 3 months, and we left a computer running in the United States with their spyware installed on it. And we kept it running for an extended period of time just to see whether they would interact with it and whether they would download additional components and whether they would try to steal certain types of information. And at some point they noticed that this computer wasn't one of their targets, and so they started sending us popping up windows in our computer with Spanish sentences written in it, threatening the person that they thought was in front of the computer of different things, killing their family and these kinds of things. At some point, we weren't really reacting because we were not monitoring the computer constantly, and I guess they thought that we didn't speak Spanish, so they switched from Spanish to English. So they started popping up windows with the same messages in some kind of English. And after not reacting to that either, they started popping up messages, the same messages in English, as well as using Windows text-to-speech functionality to actually have the computer speak the message itself. So the computer started speaking, and at that point we kind of realized something going on, which doesn't really happen very often. Which it's a symptom that is probably not necessarily a state agency or specific state agency behind it just because of the sloppiness of these types of attacks. But it's also another interesting aspect that it's not always governments going after journalists. Very often it could be other types of attackers. It could be corporations, depending on what type of topics you deal with, what type of sources you interact with. It could be, depending also on the country. Citizen Lab published similar reports on media activists in Syria publishing information on what ISIS was doing on the ground, and also ISIS employed similar tactics to go after these media activists. So that's another lesson learned, which is not always a state, not always a government, and they don't always have the best resources available, but it's still a huge spectrum of types of attacks and attackers that could go after you.
Yeah, and so it's right to remind that, we talked before about, state attacks or state spyware, but in reality, as you said, the subject that may be interested in spying or attacking journalists may be different depending on the situation, on the countries, so actually there are multiple subjects in this arena, unfortunately. And I would ask you to ask you a question about the type of attacks, because from the example we saw, the sophistication of the attack vector didn't seem to be, very high, very sophisticated. So you may think, it's okay, I just have to be careful with attachments in the mail and I'm fine. So what I would like you to explain a little bit is if there are other types of attacks in order to infect people, if there are more sophisticated ones, and
There's actually another example which is slightly off topic in the sense that it didn't necessarily direct journalists, but just to show similar tactics. So one of the actually very, very first cases that we worked on, in this case, was related to Finfisher, which is another company that produces spyware. Again, in the context of the Arab Spring, but in this case was in the context of Bahrain. Bahrain was under a lot of heavy political distress, a lot of protests in the streets that in the end managed to be cracked down. And a lot of people started getting targeted, both activists on the ground as well as media activists and journalists abroad, and so on and so forth. And at that point, we were able to get in contact with some of these people in and outside of Bahrain and collecting some data. This is an example of one of those attacks that has been delivered back then. You see the date is April 2012. And at that time in Bahrain was still quite under protests and so on. This is a typical example. You get an email. In this case, in other cases, they sometimes spoof names and email addresses of existing journalists, for example, from Al Jazeera and organizations of this kind, pretend to be a journalist or pretend to be a source, sharing information of different kinds. And this is the case of an email that was sent to Ala Shahabi, which is a Bahraini activist, but many other similar emails were delivered. For example, this is another one. There was Melissa Chan, for instance, is a reporter from Al Jazeera, and they spoofed their name, and they sent an email to a bunch of Bahraini activists and journalists, again pretending to have some kind of information about people on the ground getting arrested by the security forces in Bahrain. And you can see in both cases they send some archives attached to the emails, and these archives would contain normally either documents, or in these specific cases they would a little bit more sophisticated in the social engineering aspect of it. When you would open the archive, you would find different files. You would find pictures mostly, and some of these pictures would actually be legitimate photos, and one of these pictures would not be a legitimate photo. You find, for instance, these ones were coming from one of these previous emails. In this case, for instance, they use a nifty trick, which is on Arab versions of Windows, you need to be able to flip the text so that it starts from right and goes to the left, obviously. So it's provided, Windows is provided with some special character that does this flipping of the text. They use this special character to flip the file name of the files that they included in these emails to make them look, instead of being .exe, as you'd see at the beginning, make them look as .jpegs. Instead, if you flip the name, you see they would be a .exe. And so the people would see it has a picture icon, it has a picture extension, would not be suspicious about it, and would just open it. And indeed then, even the ones that were malicious would open a picture, but in the background execute some code that would compromise the computer. And then at that point, people would not realize anything actually happened. While in some other cases, as we see before, there's some symptoms that something odd is going on. But if you receive an email from a trusted journalist sharing information with you and sharing photos, and most of them are actual photos, and the one that actually isn't still opens photos, then you would not suspect anything. And that's what happened in most cases. And we had many examples of that coming from Bahrain. This was another one, this was another one, and so on. Other types of attacks, these are the most common. You receive an email which is pretending to be something that it's not, coming from someone who's not real or is not the right person, and they contain either directly the malware, the spyware that they want to deploy on you, or they would contain a first stage exploit that would then leverage different vulnerabilities to deploy the type of attacks. This is the most common because it's the easiest thing to do. It doesn't require any control over your internet connection. It doesn't require anything really besides some knowledge of who you are and what you're interested in. And being a journalist, that's quite easy to get. You know, seeing what you publish, seeing what kind of topics you cover, you can quite easily craft email or a document that would most likely interest you, and you would be more stimulated to open, and then you get compromised. So that's very easy, and it's very common, again, in the context of diaspora situations where journalists are abroad. The attackers don't have easy access, physical access, or network access to the journalists, and so they use this type of malicious emails to send these attacks out. There's other types of attacks. I made a little table here. Let me zoom out a little bit. So these are the things that you can most commonly expect. Obviously, bear in mind that the types of attacks are very contextual to both your situation, where you are in a country, outside of the country, whether the security forces or the attackers that you are going after, or that they're coming after you, are more or less sophisticated. So it really depends. Security is always kind of a trade-off between different conditions. So these are the types of attacks. Most common, phishing, happens a lot, especially against journalists. One of the main intent of going after journalists is to get access to their communications, get access to their email accounts, get access to their Facebook accounts. Once the attacker gets access to your account, they're being able to see all the emails that you exchanged and who you've been exchanging emails with. And while they might not directly interested in, arresting you or threatening you, they are interested in reconstructing your network and perhaps find additional sources within the country and arrest them. So this happens a lot, and it's still incredibly successful as a technique. I've seen cases where people have been targeted with phishing attacks multiple times. For those who don't know what phishing is, it's simply the practice of sending someone an email, not containing any attachment, but just pretending to be, for example, an email from Google or an email from Facebook, and then telling you that something happened. For example, your account got locked, and then they prompt you to a website that looks exactly like Google and looks exactly like Facebook, and they ask you to insert the credentials for your account so they can unlock your account. Or if you received a message, they tell you received a message, log into the account. And then people do. The moment they do, their credentials get stolen, and then they get most often redirected to the actual Google and the actual Facebook, so they don't notice actually anything. But at that point, their account is lost, and the attackers can log in and see everything that they've done with their accounts. And at that point, the whole network is compromised. So it's not just necessarily about you or necessarily about the journalist in the specific case, but more often is about the whole network and the whole amount of people that you communicate with. So in this sense, also another lesson to be learned, which is when you think about security, do not just think as something for yourself. You need to protect your sources, you need to protect your colleagues, and once you're compromised, the whole network, the whole organization is compromised as well. So yeah, phishing is very common. I've seen cases of people getting phished multiple times and getting their accounts stolen. Some cases, even all of their emails published online as a smear campaign type of thing. And it's still very successful for some reason. They're generally crafted quite well. It's hard to identify that it's not actually Google or it's not actually Facebook. But here's the first lesson of the day. Nobody ever solicits accounts to you. Google will never ask you to log in into anything. Facebook will never ask you to log in into anything. If you receive an email asking you to log into something, it's not a good email. Trash it immediately, and don't do what they ask you to do. So as a prevention, it's very common, and preventing getting victim of these types of things, it's quite easy. Just don't do it. It's easy as that. Spear phishing, we already talked about it. Also very common under certain circumstances. Quite hard to deal with. Because if they're crafted well, they're very different to tell apart from legitimate emails. And if the attacker is resourceful enough and have access to exploits that are not public yet, it's very difficult to see that something actually went wrong. In this case, you kind of need to be a little bit more careful. When you receive unsolicited emails pretending to be too good news to be true, then it's probably actually not good news. So if someone sends you an email out of the blue and you did not expect anything, don't be excessively paranoid, but be a little bit suspicious and make sure that the information that has been sent to you is not malicious. Perhaps, I don't know, open it on a different computer first, and then open it on the computer that you do all your journalistic work with. But it's quite hard to deal with, and there's no easy answer to this. Strategic web compromise is another type of attack, happens sometimes, it's not very common, and it is basically the practice of compromising a website. For example, I've seen some cases of some group of bloggers that publish their articles on a single blog that they installed somewhere with WordPress or anything like that. And the attacker has interest in identifying all of the people that work on this blog, and so they attack the website instead. They don't go directly after the victim, but they attack the website, they compromise the website, they include some malicious content inside the website, so at the point where all the administrator or the people that have accounts to it log in, they can also be attacked afterwards. It is really hard to deal with because you need to have knowledge about maintaining a secure infrastructure, maintaining a secure website, and it's completely out of the scope and out of the role of a journalist. But it happens sometimes, so in that case, consult with a security person, consult with a security firm, maybe have a pen test to your website and make sure that at least the basic security practices are in place so that your website isn't exposing any vulnerability and so that it doesn't compromise. It doesn't get compromised so that you would get targeted as well as your visitors and your readers get targeted as well. Network injection, very rare. Generally, it can only happen in most cases unless you're the NSA. They are the NSA, your adversary is the NSA. But in most cases, it only happens if you're residing you live within the same country in which you operate. So, for example, if you're a journalist in, I don't know, Iran or a journalist in some other country and you live within the country and you get identified by the attackers as an interesting person, having access or having control over your internet connection, they're able to use certain types of network attacks to hijack the established network communications that you have and include on the fly malicious content into it so you won't even notice. For example, you use Office or you use, I don't know, Adobe Reader, or you have other applications that you use quite often. These applications most often regularly checks for updates, and without actually asking you anything, they will download the updates and maybe ask you to install it, clicking OK, install the update. This just very standard and very innocuous action of a software that you use downloading an update from the internet can very easily be hijacked and used to include malicious content in the update, so that when you install the update to Office, it doesn't just install the update, but also install a Trojan or a spyware. And at that point, firstly, you've done nothing wrong, because from a security point of view, it did no mistakes. And secondly, you're compromised, and you can't do anything about it until you notice that you've been compromised. It's very difficult to deal with.
I have a question about this. You need to have the ISP collaboration for this, right, or not?
In most cases, yes, but consider there's many countries that have maybe one or two ISPs, and some of them are owned by the state. So in those cases, it's quite easy for them. But even if that's not the case, if the attacker is a state agency, they can just get a warrant, and then the ISP is obliged to comply to the warrant. In European countries, it's perhaps a little bit legally difficult to do this. But we're actually moving towards this direction. So, for instance, in UK, there's been this debate about the IP bill. I don't know if you read about it, but they're proposing some new laws to increase the capabilities of the security agencies. And one of the things that they're asking is to get warrant to do exactly this. So to force vendors and ISPs to abuse their update mechanism and abuse their services to deploy malware on the computers. So it's not too far-fetched, but it's kind of expensive to do technically and from a resource point of view, and it doesn't happen too often. It's not something you necessarily have to worry about. Next one is IP steal, which is also very common in certain geographical areas, and it's a very simple thing. Mostly it spreads through social media. So for example, doesn't really apply to journalists as much. This is applied mostly to activists and to sources that try to remain anonymous online. There's many people, sometimes bloggers even in certain countries, that are critical of the state, and they publish information about the state or articles about the state, and they don't want to expose their identity, so they use a pseudonym also online. So they create a Twitter account, they create a Facebook account with a different name than theirs, and they operate under this fake persona. When these things happen, which is not also too uncommon, a very easy thing is to trick them into opening a link, and the link doesn't do anything actively malicious. It just redirects you from, for example, you receive a direct message on Twitter or a message on Facebook, and they say, oh, read this article on, I don't know, The Guardian or the New York Times. They'll send you a link, very often using those URL shortening services so that the URL is smaller. And at the end, it will direct the browser to the actual article, which is legitimate, but in between, it'll make some requests to some other servers that are uniquely just grabbing the IP address from which you're connecting from and storing it and associating with you in specific. So, for instance, this is a very trivial method to de-anonymize online journalists and online activists, just by, especially if you're within a certain country, then they get your IP address. In most cases, they get directly your identity, or at least they get your geographical location. We saw that a lot, for instance, in Bahrain, as a tactic being employed. And the last one is passive wiretapping. I mean, this is not news, and it's not something that necessarily it's necessarily concerning for a journalist, because at that point in our countries, it's something that you would really need a cooperation of an ISP, and there's certain bureaucratical processes to be followed to do wiretapping of a customer, but it is a thing that happens. As time goes on and technology evolves, cryptography kind of prevents this problem. Once you use encrypted communication platforms, then wiretapping and just intercepting your traffic is pointless. So it's probably going to decrease in popularity as a practice, but it still happens. And preventing from it, it's tedious, as in you need to learn what cryptography is, or at least need to learn what tools to use that use cryptographic methods, but it's doable. And it's becoming more and more easy as time goes and more tools get developed. So yeah.
Yeah. So before we talked about spyware, but of course there are other types of attacks. And what is chilling sometimes is that there are cases where we don't even have the information to understand what type of attacks are undergoing. This was the case with Twitter when in last December, Twitter sent some notifications to a small number of users that were, most of them had the connection to the security and privacy advocacy. There were some activists, some researchers, some people connected to the Tor developers, and some other people, it was not really clear, so all these people have been informed by Twitter that their accounts had been targeted by state-sponsored hackers or attackers. That's what Twitter said. There was a notice appearing in the inboxes of these users saying this, but it wouldn't say much more. Maybe the hackers or attackers were trying to steal the users' email addresses or the IP addresses or the phone numbers attached to the accounts. But it's really unclear whether Twitter was compromised, whether the accounts were targeted individually, and what were they looking for, if it was really a targeted attack or something else. And so basically, there was this paradox that the effort by Twitter of being transparent and advising users backlashed because of the lack of details of this information. So users were saying, okay, but what really happened? How do you know it was a state-sponsored attack? What type of attack? And so on. And it struck me just because it was very difficult to get information on this, even to make up, an idea in your mind about what was happening. At least in the case of spyware, you have, like malware samples to study. In some other cases, it seems even more difficult. I don't know. What's your opinion about such case?
So the case of Twitter is bizarre because it was really vague in the details. Well, actually, there was really no details at all. They just notified some users that they were being targets of certain types of targeted attacks. In that case, it's really hard. It happens. Google has been doing this for years. You can see screenshots of this. Google is probably in a better place to do these types of notifications because they have a huge security team and research team that does engage into researching targeted attacks and state-sponsored actors quite actively. Twitter probably doesn't have as much. But if you receive this type of notification, then it's bad news, meaning that firstly, you could try to inquire the service provider to give you more details. Twitter has not done so far as I can tell. In some other situations, for instance, Google did provide some more details in similar situations in the past, but they generally don't tell you much. They don't tell you what happened, don't tell you how to react to it in depth. So in this case, your better option is first, change all the passwords to all of your accounts. Perhaps trash the computer if you're really paranoid, or give it to some security expert to make an assessment of it. I do believe that there's always a certain level of truth behind these notifications, because also during the course of my research, for example, we came across attacks or situations in which we identified, for instance, a phishing infrastructure being employed by certain types of attacker, and we identified a number of email addresses that were being stolen. And in that case, we would notify Google and say, these email accounts have been stolen. And in that sense, perhaps Google would then send this kind of notification to the victim to inform that their account have been compromised and it's been under a state-sponsored attack. I know, looking at it, it looks quite scary, and being told just by a red bar on the top of your email account that you're being targeted of a state-sponsored attack, it's quite distressing as a message to receive. But it's to be taken seriously. I wouldn't dismiss that entirely. I would definitely ask for the service provider to provide more information. But at that point, you need to be sure that something has been compromised, and you really need to react to it quickly before everything else gets compromised as well.
Oh, thank you. Do you have, since we have really a few minutes, do you have questions, please? Or
there's actually one last slide.
Oh, okay. Yes.
From an operation security point of view, at least something to start from. I'm sure that some of these things have been discussed quite heavily in the last few days and will be in the next 2 days. But there are certain things that you can do to have a better stance. There are some tools that help you communicating securely with your sources. There are some tools that can help you maintaining a better security state. These are some of them. Tor browser, probably all of you know about it. Simple application that is just Firefox modified versions of Firefox that will just route all of your requests through Tor. So in this case, it protects you from being de-anonymized, for example, by those IP steal type of attacks, or it protects you from getting intercepted over the wire and other types of threats. Very useful to use, especially if you need to access certain resources anonymously. Tails is a hardened volatile operating system which routes everything through Tor, so all of your traffic is de-anonymized. Learning curve for Tails, it's medium hard, depends if you have any experience with using Linux systems. If you don't have, it might be hard, and you might want to try to look for instance, crypto parties and these types of events that with people training you how to use these systems and these tools, but it's another very useful resource. SubGraphOS, also hardened operating system, very useful to protect you from exploitation attempts and these kinds of things, also pretty hard to use. Signal, probably all of you know about this. Mobile application that allows you to communicate with an end-to-end encryption with your contacts and your sources. Must-have application. It's very, very, very easy to use. You just download it from the App Store or the Google Play Store and so on. You just install it, you receive a verification message, and then you're done. You'll see all the contacts that have the same application, and you can communicate securely. OTR. It's a platform to communicate also using end-to-end cryptography on Jabber, on Gmail, Gtalk, and these types of platforms. A little bit difficult to use, but very useful as well if you use these types of messaging platforms. PGP for encrypting emails, also something that we all know. It's a nightmare as a learning curve because their implementations of clients for PGP tend to be very badly designed and very difficult to maintain and very difficult to understand. I'm not advocating to not using it, but good luck learning how to use that.
I like the learning curve you.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. It's a really hard thing to use. Yeah. And yes, we're out of time. Last thing, basic digital hygiene is your best friend, really. No antivirus will save you, no magic software will save you. Just learn the very basic issues on operating with a computer device and learn to be a little bit suspicious of things that you were not expected to receive. And that will save you a lot of troubles already. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all. If you have questions later.